What's going on, smart people? Bringing you a coding video today on how to dot two vectors into each other. And I think this will be useful for those of you who might be new to doing things like calling functions, working with arrays, maybe looping through arrays and lists inside of functions, things like that. So without any further ado, let's get started. Now for the record, I'm going to be doing all of this in Python. Okay, and to get started, I do what I always do. I just import the necessary libraries that I'm going to be using. Fortunately for this, it's only going to be one library, and that's going to be NumPy. And that's going to give us access to arrays, because Python doesn't have native arrays. And I don't feel like writing NumPy over and over, so I'm going to import NumPy as NP. Now we want to take the dot product of two vectors. So first we need to define what those vectors are. I'll call the first one v1, and that's going to be equal to numpy.array. Don't forget your parentheses, and inside we put two square brackets, and now we can enter the elements of the array. Let's just do 1, 2, 3. So that's like saying, just for the record, that's like saying I plus 2j plus 3 k if you do the ijk notation. Then we can also create our second vector. We'll call it v2, and that's going to be equal to numpy.array. We could use list, but if we ended up working with really large data sets, it would be efficient to transition over to using arrays anyways, because they typically are able to be looped through faster. So that's why we're using arrays here. Do the same thing, create our array, and let's make this one 2, 3, 4. Okay, so just to be thorough, this is 2i plus 3j plus 4k. Cool, so what is a dot product? A dot product, you take the first elements of two vectors and you multiply them together, and you do that for all of the elements in the vector, and you add them all up at the end. So let's define a function to do exactly that. And the way that we'll do that, you do define, and we'll call our function dot product. Now this doesn't automatically know that I'm talking about a dot product. This is just for, if someone were to read this code, they could look at this and say, oh, this is probably where a dot product is happening. And we need to pass some parameters to it. What does our dot product function depend on? Well, it's going to depend on the two vectors that we're using. So let's call one vector A and one vector B just to keep it general. And what this tells you is that Python actually lets you pass arrays and lists as arguments to functions. Which actually isn't all that unique, but still, you might not know that. You might think you can only pass like floats or integers. Okay, so let's, what are we going to return here? Well, let's define the total, which is just going to be the value that spits out at the end for our dot product. And we're gonna do this kind of the inefficient way real quick. We're gonna do this the way that you would have to do it on paper, where you explicitly write out each term that you're doing, and then towards the end we're gonna come back and we're gonna figure out how to do this much faster, which is going to be very beneficial if we're importing data. Large amounts of data that we don't have to explicitly write out each term. So to put in a coding context what we defined a dot product as earlier, well, that's going to be the first element of the first vector times the first element of the second vector plus the second element of the first vector times the second element of the second vector, and so on. So to write that, we can write this as A0, because Python arrays and lists start at 0, times B0 plus A1 times B1 plus A2 times B2. And we're going to return what this gives us. Return total. Okay, if we were to run the code, nothing would happen. It would just tell us that, hey, we wrote a code that doesn't have errors in it. So now what we have to do is we have to call the function. We have to call the function and pass it some actual values that it can work with. Let's go ahead and call that answer. Answer is equal to, call the function, ring, dot product evaluated at v1 and v2. and then we're going to print off what this is. We're going to say print v1 dot v2 equals comma answer. So we have 1 times 2 plus 2 times 3 plus 3 times 4. So that's 2 plus 6 plus 12. So that's going to give us 20. So let's see if that's what we get. Awesome. Now, say we were importing a huge amount of data, and that data comes in and is stored in a list or some array, and we want to say that's some multidimensional vector that we want to find the dot product of for some reason. Well, if our new vector, say, has like 100,000 elements to it or something, you can see that would be very crappy to have to write, A all the way up to 1,000 or something like that. So that's screaming, whenever you have to do something over and over and over again, that's screaming, try to loop it somehow. And so let's get rid of this, and let's find out a better way of expressing this. What we're doing when we do a dot product is we're summing over some index that's mutual between each vector. So we're doing A0 times B0 plus A1 times B1. So if we can loop over that index, we can get to this dot product a lot faster. So let's initialize some value. We're going to call it total equals 0.0. And since whenever we dot two vectors into each other, those vectors are always going to have the same length. Okay, it's always going to be x, y, z times x, y, z. So that means that we can loop through the length of one of them. So I can say for I in range, and then just the length of one of the vectors. So let's say length of A. So that's telling me that I want I to run through as many elements as A has. So for I in range, length A, we could use B, it wouldn't change the answer. What I want to do is I want to take the previous total and add it to, here, let me write it out first, because it's always hard to talk and write. What I'm doing is I'm taking the previous total and adding it to the new AI times BI. So if I equals 0, then it's going to be 0 plus 1 times 2. And then that's going to be our new total. And then it's going to be added through each subsequent iteration. So it's going to be 0 plus 1 times 2 plus 2 times 3 plus 3 times 4. And then we're going to return that value again. Okay, so just to write it out here exactly what we're doing, because I feel like that might not have been totally explicit. So it's saying this plus equals means this is the same thing as saying total plus. Okay, but our total we're initializing at 0. So this is saying 0.0 plus AIBI. I is going to start at 0, so it's going to be 1 times 2. And then we're going to go back and start the loop over at I equal 1, which is going to be plus 2 times 3, and so on. It's just implementing the dot product. And let's see what happens when we do this. We get the same thing. Go figure. Quick breakaway just to let you guys know that if you notice in the last clip, you'll see that it says total plus equals plus and then the vector. That second plus should not be there. It doesn't affect the answer, but just letting you know that it should just be plus equals, not plus equals plus. Okay, back to the video. So this would be much more optimal, like I said, if you're using a large data set. But if you're new to Python programming and you're not really sure what you're allowed to call functions or pass to functions, and you're not too comfortable with looping as a whole, I think this could be pretty beneficial. I hope you guys did find it helpful. Let me know in the comments section if you did, and I'll see you guys there.